Right now, 56 million Americans are working full-time jobs with zero access to a retirement plan. No 401k, no pension, no employer match, nothing. The financial system loves to lecture people about saving for retirement, but what nobody wants to admit is that millions of Americans literally don't even have the option. And the worst part, the people being blamed for not saving are the same people the system has structurally locked out for decades. Today, I want to expose what's actually happening because this isn't a small problem. This is a slow-moving national catastrophe, and we are just a few years away from seeing the fallout hit like a freight train. And before I get into it, let me make one thing clear. I've worked in fintech and banking for decades. I have a finance degree and an MBA. I've seen firsthand how retirement systems are built, how they function, and who they leave behind. And what I'm about to show you is the part of the system nobody talks about, because it reveals that millions of Americans aren't behind on retirement due to irresponsibility, but because the system was never designed with them in the first place. Half of all private sector workers in America have no access to an employer-sponsored retirement plan. Let me repeat that. 50%. That's 56 million people who physically cannot contribute to a retirement account through their job. And if you add gig workers, freelancers, cash employees, that number jumps to 83 million. 83 million Americans are locked out of the system. That's nearly 1 in 3 adults. We're talking about people who clock in every day, work full-time jobs, sometimes holding 2 or 3 jobs, and still have zero access to any retirement structure. No automatic payroll deductions, no employer match, no tax advantage savings pipeline. They are working in an economy that punishes them for things completely outside their control. And this isn't an exaggeration. The data is brutal. 30% of Americans over the age of 59 have zero retirement savings. 1 in 4 Americans retiring today have nothing saved at all. Think about that. People who've worked for 40 years are hitting retirement age with nothing, not because they didn't try, but because the tools simply never existed for them. And when you look at who gets left behind, it becomes obvious this isn't random. The system has clear winners and clear losers, and the losers are always the same groups. Part-time workers, automatically excluded from retirement benefits at most companies. Someone working 25 or 30 hours per week isn't eligible. These are people working the same jobs, the same hours, the same responsibilities. But because their weekly schedule drops below an arbitrary threshold, they're locked out. Small business workers? If you work for a company with fewer than 50 employees, which is half the private workforce, chances are your employer doesn't offer a 401k. Not because they don't care, but because the cost for a small business to maintain a retirement plan is ridiculously high. So entire industries, retail, hospitality, construction, healthcare support, simply go without. Gig workers and freelancers, completely abandoned. Uber drivers, DoorDash delivery workers, Instacart shoppers, freelance designers, independent contractors, all told to save on their own. But without payroll deductions or employer contributions, saving becomes 10 times harder. And with inconsistent income, saving becomes almost impossible. Service workers, restaurant staff, cash-based workers, tipped employees, all structurally excluded. And then there are the racial disparities. Black and Hispanic workers are far more likely to work in jobs without retirement benefits. Women who take career breaks for caregiving get hit twice. First by losing years of income, then by losing years of contributions. So when people say, just save on your own, they're ignoring the reality that millions of people never had a fair shot. And here's the part almost nobody understands. Telling people to just save outside of work is financially ridiculous advice, because saving outside of payroll deductions is not the same as saving through a retirement plan. Automatic payroll deductions increase savings rates by nearly 300%. 300%. Humans save dramatically more when savings happen automatically. When you make someone manually move money every month, they won't. Not because they're irresponsible, but because that's how human psychology works. And then there's the employer match. It's free money. If you don't have a 401k, you lose free money every single year. A typical match can add thousands a year to your retirement. People without access lose that forever. Then there are the tax advantages. Tax-deferred growth, tax-free Roth growth, the ability to reduce taxable income, employer contributions not taxed as income, and more. If you don't have a 401k, you lose all of these advantages. You're saving in a taxable account, getting hit with taxes every year, and falling further behind. And let's talk about emergency savings, because this matters more than people realize. The median emergency fund in America is $500. One-third of Americans have zero emergency savings. When you have $0 saved, when your car breaks down, when rent jumps, when medical bills hit, you can't invest for retirement. You're just trying to survive long enough to get to your next paycheck. That's why telling people to just do it yourself is one of the biggest lies in personal finance. Without access to a structured system, savings don't happen, and the data proves it. And now we get to the part that scares me the most, the compounding catastrophe. Because the financial cost of being locked out isn't a few $1,000s, it's hundreds of thousands, even millions over a lifetime. Let me show you exactly how devastating it is. Take just $10,000 invested at age 25. With a 10% return, that becomes $174,000 by age 65. Now imagine missing 20 years of compounding because you didn't have a 401k until your 40s. That's not losing $174,000. That's losing the ability to ever catch up. Compounding is exponential. Once you miss the early decades, the damage is permanent. And it gets worse. Hardship withdrawals hit a record high, 4.8% of all 401k accounts in 2024, up from just 2.8% 2 years earlier. People are pulling money because they're drowning, and early withdrawals are financially devastating. If you pull $30,000 from a 401k at age 35, you're not losing $30,000. You're losing $500,000 you would have had at 65. That's a $500,000 mistake driven by financial desperation. And for the 56 million Americans without retirement plans, they don't even have the option to withdraw early because they never had the savings to begin with. And when they hit retirement age, guess what they're left with? Social Security. And Social Security alone pays an average of $1,300 a month. That's poverty-level income. And today, 80% of older Americans are already financially struggling. This isn't a future problem. It's happening right now. And the future looks even darker. Social Security is projected to become insolvent by 2033. And when that happens, benefits are estimated to be cut by 24%. Nearly one quarter. Imagine living on $1,300 a month right now. Then imagine losing a quarter of that. That is the future millions of Americans are heading toward. And the safety nets we rely on are already overwhelmed. Housing assistance, wait lists are full, food programs, overloaded, medical programs, cutting benefits every year. We are heading toward a mass elderly poverty crisis between 2030 and 2040. A crisis of unprecedented scale, and it's irreversible for current workers. Because if you missed your opportunity to save in your 20s, 30s, 40s, you can't just start later and make up for it. Compounding doesn't allow that. And this brings me to the most important point. This crisis is not the workers' fault. It's a system design failure. We built a retirement system that only works for people in stable, full-time, benefit-eligible jobs. But the modern workforce is not stable. It isn't full-time. And it isn't benefit-eligible. People are working multiple part-time jobs. People are working gig jobs. People are freelancing, contracting, and doing cash work to survive. And the system refuses to adapt. So what happens next? Millions will retire with nothing. Millions will rely exclusively on Social Security. At the exact moment those benefits get cut, families will be forced into multi-generational support structures. Adult children will financially support aging parents. Home ownership rates will fall. Consumer spending will drop. Poverty rates among seniors will hit levels America has never seen. And this isn't a prediction. It is mathematically inevitable. And here's the truth. Nobody in the financial industry wants to say out loud, we created a system where retirement is a luxury, a system where only people with the right jobs, the right employers, the right benefits, the right structure, and the right stability can build wealth. Everyone else, they're told to be disciplined while being denied the exact tools that make discipline possible. I've seen people work 40 years and retire with nothing. I've seen people break their backs in physical jobs only to realize they'll never be able to stop working. I've seen people in tears because they physically cannot save. Not because they didn't want to, but because the system made it impossible. And the more I dig into this, the clearer it becomes that the retirement crisis isn't just an economic issue, it's a structural flaw built into the foundation of how America designed its financial system. Because when you really look at the architecture of retirement in this country, it's basically a machine that only works for a small segment of the population. Everyone else is left on the outside looking in, trying to build financial security with tools that were never meant to work without employer infrastructure behind them. And no amount of budgeting, discipline, or personal responsibility can compensate for the absence of that structure. We have built a system that rewards stability, but we've created an economy based on instability. It's a contradiction at the heart of how America works today. The modern workforce is unrecognizable compared to the workforce these retirement tools were originally built for. 40 years ago, people worked full-time at a single company for decades. They had pensions. They had defined benefits. They had predictable income. Employers invested in workers long-term, and retirement was part of that investment. Today, people jump jobs every 2 years because they have to. Companies hire part-time workers to avoid offering benefits. Entire industries rely on contractors, gig workers, and freelancers who have no safety net at all. Our retirement system is a 1980s solution, forced onto a 2025 workforce, and it simply does not fit. And when you try to force an outdated system onto a modern economy, you create the exact crisis we're seeing now. People aren't failing because they made bad decisions. They're failing because the system is decades behind reality. Think about it. A worker in 1985 could support a family, buy a house, and save for retirement on one full-time salary. A worker in 2025 can work 50 hours a week and still barely afford rent. The cost of housing, insurance, food, transportation, everything has exploded. But wages for most Americans haven't moved in decades. When you combine rising costs with disappearing benefits, you get a population that is working harder than ever but falling further behind every year. And for the people with no retirement plan at work, the gap becomes permanent. Because once you miss the early compounding years, you don't get a second chance. I've talked to people in their mid-50s who tell me, I'll just start now and double up. But doubling up doesn't work. The math doesn't allow it. If you don't get your money invested early, compounding doesn't have time to do its job. Saving later in life is like trying to run a marathon after the race has already ended. You can still run, but you'll never catch up to the people who started earlier with the right foundation. And that's the invisible tragedy behind these numbers. Millions of Americans will go through their entire lives believing they failed at money, when in reality, the system failed them. I've seen this firsthand in the banking world. I've sat across from people who were ashamed, embarrassed, apologizing for their financial situation, thinking it was their personal weakness. But when you actually look at their circumstances, part-time jobs, no benefits, unstable income, high living costs, saving wasn't just difficult, it was mathematically impossible. They were never given the tools necessary to even begin building wealth. And here's the part that breaks my heart. The people most affected by this crisis are the ones who work the hardest. Physical laborers, service workers, caretakers, hospitality workers, the backbone of the country. These are the people who kept the economy running during the pandemic. The people who keep our hospitals, hotels, airports, restaurants, and stores functioning. And yet they're the ones America abandoned when it came to retirement. They gave the country decades of labor, and in return, the system gave them nothing. I've met workers who spent 30 years in restaurant kitchens, on their feet for 10-hour shifts, and retired with nothing. Workers who spent decades lifting, building, cleaning, caring, all without a single employer retirement contribution. Meanwhile, someone in a corporate office, sitting at a desk for 8 hours a day, gets thousands a year in employer match. It's not that the corporate worker doesn't deserve their benefits. It's that the system created two classes of workers, those with access to wealth-building tools and those without. And once you understand that divide, everything else makes sense. And if nothing changes, the financial impact will ripple far beyond individuals. Because when millions of people retire with nothing, the burden shifts to the entire country. Younger generations will be forced to financially support their parents. Taxpayers will absorb the cost of increased social assistance programs. The healthcare system will strain under the weight of older Americans who can't afford basic care. The housing market will see a surge in elderly homelessness. Local governments will face massive budget pressure, and consumer spending, the engine of the U.S. economy, will drop sharply as millions of retirees cut back to survival-level living. This is not a crisis that will stay contained to one demographic. It will reshape the entire economic landscape of the United States. And what frustrates me most is that we know how to fix this. Other countries have universal retirement systems. Other economies have mandatory employer contributions, automatic savings mechanisms, or government-led retirement programs that cover everyone, not just people with the right job. The solutions exist. America simply hasn't implemented them. And this is why I make videos like this. Because 56 million Americans aren't failing. The system is failing them. And the more we talk about this, the more pressure we put on policymakers, employers, financial institutions, and lawmakers to fix the root issue: access. Because when people are given access, they save. When savings are automated, people build wealth. When employers contribute, outcomes improve. When tax advantages exist, long-term growth becomes possible. The system works, but only for the people inside the system. 56 million Americans are locked out of retirement savings. Not because they're irresponsible, not because they don't want to save, but because the system was never designed to let them succeed. And when this entire generation retires with nothing, the entire country will pay the price.